1.1.1 Issue of Private Pilot License. Basic requirements to obtain a private pilot's license. 1. Minimum age 17. 2. Minimum Category 3 medical. 3. 40 hours of ground school. 4. Minimum 60% overall and individual subject areas in written exam. 5. Minimum 45 hours flight training may include a maximum of 5 hours in a simulator or flight training device. 6. Minimum 17 hours dual flight. 7. Minimum 12 hours solo including 5 hours cross-country time. 8. Must have completed a cross-country flight of at least 150 nautical miles which includes at least 2 en route full stop landings. 9. Successful flight test. Key Category 3 Medical Validity Facts. 1. If a medical is valid for 60 months, the actual period of validity is to the first day of the 61st month after which medical was done. 2. For those under 40 years of age the medical validity is 60 months, but once over 40 years of age, it is only 24 months. 3. ECG requirements. At first examination after reaching 40 years old and thereafter within the 4 years before the medical exam. What happens if you fail the written exam and need to rewrite? If you fail the written exam you may pay to rewrite the exam 14 days after the first failure, 30 days after the second failure, in the case of 1/3 or subsequent failure, 30 days plus an additional 30 days for each failure in excess of 2 failures up to a maximum of 180 days. 1.1.2 Privileges of holding a private pilot license for airplanes. The holder of a private pilot license is permitted to fly. 1. As pilot in command or co-pilot of an aeroplane of a class and type for which one has the required ratings. 2. As a pilot in command of an ultralight airplane. 3. As a pilot in command or co-pilot of any aircraft for the sole purpose of the one's flight training provided the training is being done under the direction and supervision of a flight instructor and that no passengers are carried on board. 4. As a pilot in command or co-pilot of any aircraft for the sole purpose of one's flight test. Very important, a private pilot may not do any of the above for hire or reward. 1.1.3 Flying at night, VFR over the top and instrument conditions. As a private pilot, you are restricted to fly in visual meteorological conditions VMC, and must comply with the Visual Flight Rules VFR. To be able to fly at night, you will need to hold a night rating. Similarly for VFR over the top, AUT, you will require a VFR over the top rating and for flying in instrument meteorological conditions IMC, you will require an instrument rating. Some important things to remember about night flying. When does night begin and end? Night is the period from the end of evening civil twilight to the beginning of morning civil twilight. This is when the sun's disk is more than 6 degrees below the horizon. Practically, night may also be considered to be the period commencing 1/2 hour after sunset and ending 1/2 hour before sunrise. Requirements which must be met for an aerodrome to be usable at night. Any area of land or water that is to be used as an aerodrome at night shall have fixed, steady, white lights to mark takeoff and landing areas, fixed red lights to mark unserviceable hazardous areas, and windsocks must be lit. 1.1.4 Aircraft Classification, Categories, Types and Classes. 1. Aircraft are anything that flies. 2. Aircraft are divided into ultralight, glider, balloon, gyroplane, helicopter, airplane. 3. Airplanes are divided into seaplanes and land planes. 4. These planes are divided into classes of thrust, which are centerline thrust, multi-engine, single engine. 5. There are multiple types for each class. Each class can have blanket type ratings for a group of types or individual type rating for the high-performance and multi-crew airplanes. Some examples. A Cessna 152 is classified as follows. Category, aeroplane. Class, Single engine land. Type, 152 covered under a blanket type rating. A Piper Seneca is classified as follows. Category, airplane. Class, multi-engine land. Type, PA-34 covered under a blanket type rating. 1.1.5, Class ratings. To obtain a seaplane class rating when you already hold a land plane rating, you must 1. Complete a total of 7 hours of seaplane training, including 2. At least 5 hours of dual instruction. 3. At least 5 takeoffs and landings as the sole occupant of the airplane. 4. A qualifying flight is required with a Transport Canada inspector or a qualified person within 12 months preceding the application for the rating. Note, the training has to include exercises on docking, sailing, taxiing, takeoffs and landings, and observations various types of water as conditions allow during the training. Similar training will be required if you wish to fly a land plane if you're licensed with a seaplane rating but not a land plane rating. 1. Complete a minimum of 3 hours of land plane training including 2. At least 2 hours dual instruction. 3. 5 takeoffs and 5 landings as sole occupant of the airplane. Note, the training has to include exercises on taxiing, takeoffs and landings including crosswind landings. 1.1.6, Type ratings. Blanket type ratings. A blanket type rating allows you to fly many different airplane types, usually within a particular category and class without obtaining individual type ratings. When you are issued your pilot license, it will typically be endorsed with the following blanket type rating: all single pilot non-high performance, single engine land planes. In reality, you will normally have to do some familiarization flights with an instructor to meet insurance requirements prior to flying a new type of aircraft. 1.1.7, Individual type ratings. Individual type ratings are required for high-performance airplanes and airplanes requiring more than one crew member. What is a high-performance airplane? 1. Certified minimum flight crew of 1. 2. Velocity never exceed, VNE, 250 KIAS or greater. 3. VSO, 80 KIAS or greater. Example: Sino-Swearinger SJ32. VNE, 320 KTS. VSO, 81 KTS. Minimum crew, 1. Requirements to fly a high-performance airplane. 1. Complete ground training. 2. Complete flight training. 3. 200 hours on airplanes. 4. Complete qualifying flight. Airplanes requiring a minimum crew of more than 1. Requirements to fly a 2-crew airplane. 1. Complete ground and flight training program. 2. Obtain at least 70% on IATRA within 24 months preceding application. 3. Complete flight training on type. 4. Have at least 250 hours pilot time in airplanes. 5. Pass a pilot proficiency check within 12 months preceding the application for the rating. Note, private pilots are not excluded from flying airplanes which require more than one crew member. There are a significant number of private pilots who fly business jets, most of which require a minimum crew of 2. 1.1.8, Maintaining the validity of your license. To meet the basic recency requirements, a pilot must 1. Have flown as pilot in command or as co-pilot within the past 5 years. Or, have successfully completed both a flight review conducted by a flight instructor and the appropriate written examination specified in the Personnel License Standards, PPAER, within the previous 12 months. 2. Which and, have completed a recurrent training program within the previous 24 months. Note, the flight instructor conducting the review must certify in your logbook that you meet the skill requirements for the license or permit as applicable. In order to carry passengers. 1. Have completed within the last 6 months 5 night or day takeoffs and 5 night or day landings, if the flight with passengers is to be conducted only by day, or 5 night takeoffs and 5 night landings, if the flight with passengers is to be conducted wholly or partly at night. If you change your address, you must notify the Department of Transportation within 7 days following the change. Demand to produce documentation. If you hold a private pilot license, permit, or rating, or are in possession of a Canadian aviation document or records, then you're required to make these documents available to a peace officer, immigration officer, or the Minister of Transport on demand. 1.1.9 Minimum visibility requirement for VFR flight. When flying within controlled airspace both during day and at night, flight visibility must be 3 miles, horizontal distance from cloud must be 1 mile, vertical distance from cloud must be 500 feet. When flying within a control zone. When operating within a control zone, CTR, which is controlled airspace, further restrictions apply. 1. The reported ground visibility must be at least 3 statute miles. 2. You may not operate less than 500 feet above the ground unless during takeoff or landing. These requirements may be relaxed if requested by the pilot. If this is allowed, you may then operate in terms of special VFR, or SVFR, which is restricted by the following conditions. 1. You must have a radio on board and obtained clearance to operate under SVFR. 2. Flight visibility and reported ground visibility is 1 mile or greater. 3. Flight must be conducted clear of cloud and within sight of the ground at all times. 4. Any other restrictions which ATC may impose. At night time there is obviously increased difficulty with complying with the conditions of SVFR and significantly greater risk of spatial disorientation and other hazards. As a consequence, SVFR will only be allowed for landing aircraft and not for departing aircraft. Note: if ATC is closed, then you must still request authorization for SVFR from the appropriate Flight Information Service en route, FISE. When flying in uncontrolled airspace and above 1,000 feet AGL. Flight visibility of 1 mile by day, 3 miles by night, horizontal distance from cloud 2,000 feet by day or night, vertical distance from cloud 500 feet by day or night. When flying in uncontrolled airspace below 1,000 feet AGL. Flight visibility of 2 miles by day and 3 miles by night, distance from cloud clear of cloud by day or by night. 1.1.10 Aircraft Equipment Requirements. Checklist of equipment required for day VFR flight. 1. An altimeter if the aircraft is only operated in uncontrolled airspace. 2. A sensitive altimeter adjustable for barometric pressure if the aircraft is operated in controlled airspace. 3. An airspeed indicator. 4. A magnetic compass. 5. A tachometer for each engine. 6. An oil pressure indicator. 7. A coolant temperature indicator for each liquid-cooled engine. 8. An oil temperature indicator for each air-cooled engine having a separate oil system. 9. A manifold pressure gauge for each reciprocating engine equipped with a variable pitch propeller or supercharged or turbocharged engine. 10. A fuel gauge which is visible to the flight crew when seated at the flight controls, which will enable the flight crew to determine the fuel quantity in each main fuel tank. 11. A landing gear position indicator or indicators visible to the flight crew when seated at the flight controls, which enable the flight crew to determine the position of the landing gear. 12. A radio communication system adequate to permit two-way communication on the appropriate frequency when aircraft is operated within Class B, Class C, or Class D airspace, and MF area, unless special arrangements are made, or the ADIZ. Survival equipment requirements for flights over land. Under most conditions, you are required to carry survival equipment, sufficient for survival on the ground, of each person on board. The equipment carried must be appropriate to the geography and area over which you are flying, the season of the year, and anticipated climate variations. The law requires that, at a minimum, you to carry means for 1. Starting a fire. 2. Providing shelter. 3. Providing or purifying water. 4. visually signaling distress. There are, however, exceptions. The survival equipment specified need not be carried in 1. Balloons, gliders, hang gliders, gyroplanes, and ultralight airplanes. 2. Aircraft that are operated within 25 nautical miles of the aerodrome of departure and have the capability of radio communication with a surface-based radio station for the duration of the flight. 3. Multi-engine aircraft that are operated south of 66 degrees 30 minutes north latitude in IFR flight within controlled airspace or along designated air routes. 4. Aircraft that are operated by an air operator, where the aircraft is equipped with equipment specified in the air operator's company operations manual, but not with the equipment required normally. A flight training organization may fit this description. 5. Aircraft that are operated in a geographic area where and at the time of year when the survival of the persons on board is not jeopardized. Seatbelt requirements. 1. Seatbelts are required for every person on board except infants. Infants are considered to be children under 2 years of age. 2. Each front seat, except on small airplanes manufactured before July 18, 1978, require a shoulder harness. 3. Every seat on small airplanes manufactured after December 12, 1986 is required to have shoulder harness. 4. Seat belts must be fastened during taxi, takeoff, and landing, and any other time considered necessary for safety. When you need to carry oxygen, how much you are required to carry and when you are required to use it. When flying an unpressurized aircraft, you should carry and use oxygen. 1. Above 10,000 feet but below 13,000 feet ASL, if you are in this altitude range for more than 30 minutes then you are required to carry oxygen for the flight crew and at least 10% of the passengers but not less than 1, for the period exceeding 30 minutes. All flight crew members are required to use oxygen for that period. 2. Above 13,000 feet ASL, all people on board are required to be using oxygen, at all times. Sufficient oxygen must be carried on board to meet the requirements of all on board for the duration of the time above 13,000 feet. Documents required on board. 1. Crew licenses and ratings. 2. Medical certificate. 3. Certificates of airworthiness. 4. Certificate of registration. 5. Journey log. 6. Proof of liability insurance. 7. Aircraft flight manual. Passenger briefing checklist includes 1. Exits. 2. Seat belts, harnesses and restraint devices. 3. ELT. 4. Survival equipment and first aid kit. 5. Flotation equipment as required for the flight. 6. Oxygen equipment. 7. Storage of luggage. 8. Seats and tables. 9. Smoking no smoking rules. Equipment required when flying over water. If you are flying over water, the law requires that you carry flotation equipment proportional to the chance that you could unintentionally end up in the water. So, the further you go or the less redundant systems you have, the more equipment you need to carry. This situation is summarized by the following. Beyond 200 nautical miles of shore, multi-engine aircraft able to maintain flight with one engine inoperative are required to carry a life raft on board in addition to a life preserver for each person. Within 200 nautical miles of shoreline or the distance which can be flown in 60 minutes at the filed cruise speed, whichever is less. 1. Single engine, or multi-engine aircraft unable to maintain flight with one engine inoperative, are required to carry a life raft on board in addition to a life preserver for each person. 2. Multi-engine aircraft able to maintain flight with one engine inoperative, are required to carry life rafts in addition to a life preserver for each person on board. Within 100 nautical miles of shoreline or the distance which can be flown in 30 minutes at the filed cruise speed, whichever is lesser. A life preserver is required for each person on board. Within 50 nautical miles of shoreline. Life preserver, individual flotation device, or personal flotation device is required for each person on board. Within glide distance no equipment is required. 1.1.11, Right-of-way. The guiding rule is stated, no person shall operate an aircraft in such a reckless or negligent manner as to endanger or be likely to endanger the life or property of any person. The law associated with the right-of-way addresses most practical situations, but be aware that you are always responsible to avoid a collision irrespective of whether or not you have the right-of-way. The law also states that the pilot in command of an aircraft that has the right-of-way shall, if there is any risk of collision, take such action as is necessary to avoid collision. When two aircraft are converging approximately head-on, each aircraft must adjust heading to the right. When overtaking an aircraft, the lead aircraft has right-of-way. The passing aircraft must pass on the right. Note, when an aircraft is required to give way to another aircraft, the pilot in command of the first mentioned aircraft shall not pass over or under, or cross ahead of, the other aircraft unless passing or crossing at such a distance as will not create a risk of collision. Remember, two aircraft on final approach. The lower aircraft has right-of-way. You may not attempt to take off or land until there is no apparent risk of collision with any aircraft, person, or structure in the takeoff or landing path. Two aircraft converging on approximately the same altitude. The aircraft which has the other aircraft on its right must give way. The following exceptions apply. 1. A power-driven, heavier-than-air aircraft shall give way to airships, gliders, and balloons. 2. An airship shall give way to gliders and balloons. 3. A glider shall give way to balloons, and 4. Power-driven aircraft shall give way to aircraft that are seen to be towing gliders or other objects or carrying a slung load. Note, the aircraft giving way to the other shall not pass over or under, or cross ahead of the other aircraft unless such action will not create a risk of collision. Note, no person shall conduct or attempt to conduct a takeoff or landing in an aircraft until there is no apparent risk of collision with any aircraft, person, vessel, vehicle, or structure in the takeoff or landing path. Emergency situations. Where the pilot in command of an aircraft is aware that another aircraft is in an emergency situation, the pilot in command shall give way to that other aircraft. 1.1.12, Airspace Division and Classification. Canadian domestic airspace is divided in many ways for different purposes. The division of airspace is usually to define areas in which specific rules and procedures apply and in which different levels and types of services are available. Southern and northern domestic airspace. Have the magnetic North Pole is located in the northern part of the country. This results in compass readings being erratic in the north and the need to rely on directions referenced to true north. In order to have all aircraft in a particular area using the same reference, the area in which the true north reference is required is defined and known as the northern domestic airspace. The remainder of the country is designated the southern domestic airspace. In the northern domestic airspace, runway headings and tracks are referenced to true north, while in the southern domestic airspace, they are referenced to magnetic north. Flight information regions. Flight information regions are areas within which flight information services and alerting services are provided from specified centers. When operating within a particular flight information region, you need to use the communication frequency specified to that FIR. The Canadian domestic airspace is divided into 7 flight information regions. These extend upwards from the surface of the Earth and are Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, Moncton, Gander Domestic, and Gander Oceanic. Altimeter and Standard Pressure Regions. Altimeter operations in the Standard Pressure Region. 1. Prior to takeoff, set the altimeter setting of aerodrome, or if not available, then set the elevation of the aerodrome. 2. Prior to level off at the desired flight level, set the altimeter subscale to standard pressure 29.92 Hg. 3. Prior to commencing your final descent to land, the altimeter should be set to the altimeter setting of the destination aerodrome. Altimeter operations in the altimeter setting region. 1. Prior to takeoff, set current altimeter setting of aerodrome, or if not available, then set to the elevation of the aerodrome. 2. During the flight, set the altimeter to the current altimeter setting of the nearest station along the route of the flight, or where the stations are more than 150 nautical miles apart, to the station nearest to the route of flight. 3. When approaching the aerodrome of intended landing, the altimeter should be set to the current aerodrome altimeter setting if available. When transferring from one region to the other, except when authorized by ATC, make the change in the altimeter setting within the standard pressure region, prior to leaving, or after entering the standard pressure region. Note how the boundaries of the northern and southern domestic airspace correspond to those for the standard pressure region and altimeter setting region respectively. Transponder airspace. Transponders enable identification of aircraft radar returns for air traffic controllers and are also essential to airborne collision avoidance systems. Altitude reporting transponders are required in Class A, Class B, Class C, and designated Class D and E airspace. Transponder codes are normally provided by ATC, but there are some standard codes which you should remember. 1. When VFR at or below 12,500 feet, squawk 1,200 unless specified by ATC. 2. When VFR above 12,500 feet, then squawk 1,400 unless otherwise specified by ATC. In the event of hijack, squawk 7,500. Communication failure, squawk 7,600. Emergency, squawk 7,700. 1.1.12, Airspace Division and Classification. Canadian domestic airspace is divided in many ways for different purposes. The division of airspace is usually to define areas in which specific rules and procedures apply and in which different levels and types of services are available. Southern and northern domestic airspace. The magnetic North Pole is located in the northern part of the country. This results in compass readings being erratic in the north and the need to rely on directions referenced to true north. In order to have all aircraft in a particular area using the same reference, the area in which the true north reference is required is defined and known as the northern domestic airspace. The remainder of the country is designated the southern domestic airspace. In the northern domestic airspace, runway headings and tracks are referenced to true north, while in the southern domestic airspace, they are referenced to magnetic north. Flight information regions. Flight information regions are areas within which flight information services and alerting services are provided from specified centers. When operating within a particular flight information region, you need to use the communication frequency specified to that FIR. The Canadian domestic airspace is divided into 7 flight information regions. These extend upwards from the surface of the Earth and are Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, Moncton, Gander Domestic, and Gander Oceanic. Altimeter and standard pressure regions. Altimeter operations in the standard pressure region. 1. Prior to takeoff, set the altimeter setting of aerodrome, or if not available, then set the elevation of the aerodrome. 2. Prior to level off at the desired flight level, set the altimeter subscale to standard pressure 29.92 Hg. 3. Prior to commencing your final descent to land, the altimeter should be set to the altimeter setting of the destination aerodrome. Altimeter operations in the altimeter setting region. 1. Prior to takeoff, set current altimeter setting of aerodrome, or if not available, then set to the elevation of the aerodrome. 2. During the flight, set the altimeter to the current altimeter setting of the nearest station along the route of the flight, or where the stations are more than 150 nautical miles apart, to the station nearest to the route of flight. 3. When approaching the aerodrome of intended landing, the altimeter should be set to the current aerodrome altimeter setting if available. When transferring from one region to the other, except when authorized by ATC, make the change in the altimeter setting within the standard pressure region, prior to leaving, or after entering the standard pressure region. Note how the boundaries of the northern and southern domestic airspace correspond to those for the standard pressure region and altimeter setting region respectively. Transponder airspace. Transponders enable identification of aircraft radar returns for air traffic controllers and are also essential to airborne collision avoidance systems. Altitude reporting transponders are required in Class A, Class B, Class C, and designated Class D and E airspace. Transponder codes are normally provided by ATC, but there are some standard codes which you should remember. 1. When VFR at or below 12,500 feet squawk 1,200 unless specified by ATC. 2. When VFR above 12,500 feet then squawk 1,400 unless otherwise specified by ATC. In the event of hijack, squawk 7,500. Communication failure, squawk 7,600. Emergency, squawk 7,700. Controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Broadly speaking, Canadian domestic airspace is divided into controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Controlled airspace is airspace of defined dimensions within which air traffic control services provided. Controlled airspace is in turn divided into smaller names airspaces whose names tell you about their function and their three-dimensional size. The name of the airspace does not, however, tell you about the rules for entry, procedures within or equipment required to enter and operate within the airspace. These rules, procedures, and requirements are determined by the way an airspace is classified. Airspace may be classified as Class A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The classification is specified so as to be suitable for the application of the airspace. Control Zone, CZ. A control zone is normally established around an aerodrome to protect IFR traffic conducting approaches from VFR traffic in conditions of low ceilings or poor visibility. The limits for VMC in controlled airspace are higher than in uncontrolled airspace. This effectively closes control zones to VFR traffic when conditions do not meet these higher minima. Control zones are usually a cylindrical controlled airspace extending from the surface and with the dimensions 3,000 feet vertical 7 nautical mile radius. Control zones at busier airports are often located within central control areas, transition areas, or control area extensions. Terminal control areas TCA. Terminal control areas are controlled airspaces designated to serve arriving, departing, and en route aircraft. TCA airspace will normally be designed in a circular configuration centered on the geographic coordinates of the primary aerodrome. That TCA is normally structured similar to an inverted wedding cake. When operational advantage may be gained, the area may be sectorized. Level 1 starts above the control zone 1,200 feet to 2,200 feet and has a radius of 12 nautical miles. Level 2 goes from 2,200 feet to 9,500 feet and is 35 nautical mile radius. Level 3 is 45 nautical miles radius starting at 9,500 feet going as high as required. Low-level airways. Low-level airways are controlled airspace is designated to serve en route traffic. VFR Airways. VFR Airways either have a VOR at each end of a segment or VOR at one end and an NDB at the other end of the segment. The approximate dimensions of VFR Airways are as follows. 1. Basic width is 4 nautical miles for VOR to VOR Airways or 4.3 nautical miles for VOR to NDB Airways either side of center line widening with distance from the end navade. 2. It is considered Class E airspace when starting at 2,200 feet AGL extending up to and including 12,500 feet or up to but not including the MEA, whichever is higher. 3. From 12,501 feet or MEA, whichever is higher it is considered Class B airspace. Low-frequency airways or LF/MF airways. Low-frequency airways are similar in structure to VFR airways with the following exceptions. Each segment has an NDB at each end whereas a VFR airway has a VOR at least one end of a segment. The width of low-frequency airways is 4.34 nautical miles either side of the center line, within the width expanding the distance away from the ends of the segment. Low-level air routes. Low-level air routes have lateral dimensions which are identical to that of low-level airways. However, the vertical structure is somewhat different. Instead of beginning at 2,200 feet AGL, they begin at the surface and extend up to but not including 18,000 feet. It is important to note that low-level air routes are uncontrolled, that is, they fall within Class G airspace. Even though ATC does not have control nor responsibility for controlling traffic within Class G airspace, UU will still be provided with flight information and alerting services by ATS units within Class G airspace. Control area extensions. Control area extensions are controlled airspace is designated around aerodromes where controlled airspace is insufficient to permit the required separation between IFR arrivals and departures and to contain IFR aircraft within controlled airspace. The second layer extends from 2,200 feet AGL to 17,999 feet AGL with a radius of 45 nautical miles. Transition areas. Transition areas are additional controlled airspace to provide for the containment of IFR operations. Starts at 700 feet AGL extending up to 2,200 feet AGL with a radius of 15 nautical miles. Airspace classification. Airspace in Canada is classified according to the rules which Transport Canada wishes to apply to that airspace. For example, control zones will be governed by different rules depending on how the airspace within the control zone is classified. Airspace classification can change according to time of day. Control zones may be classified as Class C during the day when there is someone in the control tower at an airport. At night, when the tower is unmanned, they may be classified as Class E airspace, which is still controlled airspace but which does not require an air traffic control clearance to enter. Class A airspace. In the southern domestic airspace, Class A airspace extends from 18,000 feet up to and including FL 600. VFR air traffic are excluded from Class A airspace. Class B airspace. All low-level controlled airspace above 12,500 feet, or the MEA whichever is higher, up to but not including 18,000 feet are designated as Class B airspace. Control zones and associated terminal control areas may also be designated as Class B airspace. Types of operations permitted, IFR and controlled VFR. Entry procedures, clearance required. Visibility and distance from cloud, VFR traffic must remain VMC. If not possible to remain VMC, then file an IFR flight plan or exit. Special VFR is permitted on request. Speed restrictions, maximum 250 knots indicated airspeed below 10,000 feet. Maximum 200 knots when below 3,000 feet AGL and within 10 nautical miles of a controlled airport. Conflict resolution, not applicable. Traffic information, not applicable as separation is provided for all aircraft. Separation, all aircraft. Transponder, Type C. Two-way radio, required. Radio navigation equipment, required. Where used, VFR airways above 12,500 feet or the MEA whichever is higher, control zones and terminal control areas. Position reporting, report all designated reporting points or been directed to do so. Class C airspace. Control zones, CZs, and terminal control areas, TCA, may be classified as Class C. Types of operations permitted, IFR and VFR. Visibility and distance from cloud, VMC as applicable to controlled airspace. Special VFR is permitted on request. Speed restrictions same as Class B. Conflict resolution, provided between VFR aircraft on request. Traffic information, is available. Separation not provided between VFR traffic. Transponder, Mode C. Two-way radio, required. Radio navigation equipment, not required. Where used, control zones and terminal control areas. Position reporting, report when requested to do so by ATC or FSS. Class D airspace. Types of operations permitted, IFR and VFR. Entry procedures, establish radio contact. Visibility and distance from cloud, VMC as applicable to controlled airspace. Special VFR permitted on request. Speed restrictions, same as Class B and C airspace. Conflict resolution, between VFR and IFR aircraft if equipped and workload permit and between VFR aircraft on request. Traffic information, available. Separation not provided between VFR traffic. Transponder, required in designated transponder airspace. Two-way radio, required, however you may enter Class D airspace without required equipment during daylight hours in VMC provided prior permission is obtained from the appropriate ATC unit. Radio navigation equipment, not required. Where used, terminal control areas and control zones. Position reporting, report when requested to do so by ATC or FSS. Class E airspace. Types of operations permitted, IFR and VFR. Enter procedures, no clearance or radio contact required for entry. Visibility and distance from cloud, VMC as applicable to controlled airspace. Special VFR permitted on request. Speed restrictions, same as Class B, C, D airspace. No conflict resolution. Traffic information, only provided to VFR traffic if ATC workload permits. Separation, not provided between VFR aircraft. Transponder, required in designated transponder airspace. Two-way radio, not required. Radio navigation equipment, not required. Where used, low-level airways, control area extensions, transition areas, and control zones without operating control towers. Position reporting, report only when requested to do so by FSS. Class F airspace. Class F airspace is special use airspace. Class F airspace can be restricted or advisory airspace and all Class F airspaces are published on the VFR aeronautical charts. Advisory airspace is to confine aircraft which are involved in special activities such as flight training, parachuting, hang gliding, soaring, aerobatics, or military operations to a specific area or to impose limitations on aircraft which are not part of these activities. If it is restricted airspace, then traffic is not authorized without the approval of the user, controlling agency. Details of if and when a restricted airspace may be entered are published in the Designated Airspace Handbook available online. If entry restrictions are subject to an airspace being active, then the active timelines will be published in Note to Airmen available to the area. If it is advisory airspace, then traffic not participating in the activities designated for the airspace should avoid flying within the airspace when it is active. Rules for operating within Class F airspace are as specified in the Designated Airspace Handbook, which is a Transport Canada publication. If no rules are specified or if the area is inactive, then the rules of the surrounding airspace apply. Class G airspace. Class G airspace is uncontrolled airspace. It is shown as the green areas fan the low charts. Types of operations permitted, IFR and VFR. Enter procedures, uncontrolled. Visibility and distance from cloud, VMC as applicable to uncontrolled airspace. Speed restrictions, same as Class B airspace. Conflict resolution, none. Traffic information, none. Separation, none. Transponder, not required. Two-way radio, not required. Radio navigation equipment, not required. Where used, whenever the need for controlled airspace does not exist. Position reporting, report on 126.7. Operations in the vicinity of forest fires. You are not permitted to operate over a forest fire area or within 5 nautical miles of a forest fire area below 3,000 feet AGL. A note to airmen may be issued defining the airspace in which forest fire fighting operations are being conducted. You may not operate within the airspace defined in the NOTAM. Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. Air Defense Identification Zones have been established off each of the Canadian coasts. The purpose of the ADIZ is to facilitate the control of aircraft and whatever they might be carrying when entering Canadian territory. Note, the exact dimensions of the ADIZ are specified in the "Designated Airspace Handbook" which is available online. Procedures when operating into, from, and within the Air Defense Identification Zone. VFR Defense Flight Plans and Itineraries. When the party to enter the ADIZ, or when departing from within the ADIZ, you're required to file a Defense Flight Plan or Defense Flight Itinerary. A Defense Flight Plan is almost identical to a regular ICAO flight plan with the following exceptions. 1. The field for type of flight must contain the letter D to indicate that it is a defense flight plan. 2. When your point of departure is from outside the ADIZ for entry into the ADIZ, then the flight plan or itinerary must indicate the estimated time and point of entry into the ADIZ. When you're departing flight for a flight into, within or out of the ADIZ, then, as soon as possible after takeoff, you must contact the Air Traffic Control Unit, Flight Service Station, or a community radio station and communicate your aircraft's location, altitude, aerodrome of departure, and if applicable, estimated time and point of a device entry. If there aren't any facilities for transmitting a flight plan or itinerary, as soon as possible after takeoff you must contact the Air Traffic Control Unit, Flight Services Station, or a community radio station and file a flight plan or flight itinerary and if applicable, indicate the estimated time and point of ADIZ entry. Required revisions to estimates. You must inform an Air Traffic Control Unit, Flight Service Station, or community's radio station if your estimates for a reporting point of entry into the ADIZ or your destination within the ADIZ changed by more than plus or minus 5 minutes. You must inform an Air Traffic Control Unit, Flight Service Station, or a community aerodrome radio station of a revised point of ADIZ entry if your estimated point of entry into the ADIZ or the center line of your route is as indicated on your flight plan or itinerary, changes more than 20 nautical miles. 1.1.13, Interception Rules. Some fundamentals to remember when intercepted. The intercepted aircraft should maintain a steady course and under no circumstances take retaliatory action such as attempting evasive action, or shining a light on the interceptor. Retaliatory action by the intercepted aircraft could be considered hostile intent, and may result in drastic consequences. Immediate action items if you are intercepted. 1. Follow the instructions of the intercepting aircraft, interpreting and responding to the visual signals. 2. If possible, notify the appropriate air traffic services unit. 3. Try to establish radio communications with the intercepting aircraft by making a general call on 121.5 MHz, and giving the aircraft identification, position, and nature of the flight. 4. Select transponder mode a code 7700 unless otherwise instructed by the Air Traffic Services Unit. Interception Signals. Series 1 through 6 Instructions. Series 1, Instructions from the intercepting aircraft, you have been intercepted. Follow me. 1. Interceptor Message. You have been intercepted, follow me. Flares dispensed in the immediate vicinity, rocking wings by interceptor. 2. Response, rocking wings. Understood and will comply. 3. Interceptor, slow, level turn to left to desired heading. 4. Response, follow intercepting aircraft. Follow immediate action items by advising ATS. Making radio contact on 121.5 MHz. Sitting transponder mode a code 7700. The day and night procedures are essentially the same with the addition at night of the flashing navigational lights at irregular intervals by both the intercepting aircraft and intercepted aircraft. Series 2, Instruction from Intercepting Aircraft, you may proceed. Intercepting aircraft executes an abrupt breakaway maneuver in the form of a climbing turn of more than 90 degrees. Intercepted aircraft will rock its wings. Intercepted aircraft can then resume its own navigation. The date and my procedures are essentially the same. Series 3, Instructions from the Intercepting Aircraft, land at this aerodrome. 1. Intercepting aircraft circles the aerodrome. 2. Intercepted aircraft lowers landing gear and follows the intercepting aircraft. If after the intercepted aircraft has overflown the runway, the pilot considers the aerodrome safe for landing, then the intercepted aircraft must proceed to land. If the aerodrome is not considered safe, then follow steps outlined in Series 4. 3. Intercepting aircraft lowers its landing gear, and overflies the runway in the direction of landing. Series 4, from intercepted aircraft, aerodrome you have designated is inadequate. There are two options for the intercepting aircraft. 1. Instruct intercepted aircraft to follow to an alternate aerodrome by raising its landing gear and executing a slow level turn to left to desired heading. Or 2. Releasing the intercepted aircraft by executing an abrupt breakaway maneuver in the form of a climbing turn more than 90 degrees. 3. Intercepted aircraft raises landing gear while overflying the landing area at a height between 1,000 feet and 2,000 feet AAE and continues to circle the aerodrome. The procedures at night is the same as during the day, with the additional requirement for the interceptor aircraft of flash landing lights while overflying the runway. Series 5, Communication from Intercepted Aircraft, cannot comply. 1. Intercepting aircraft uses Series 2 signals. 2. Intercepted aircraft switches all available lights on and off in a regular manner, in a way that is distinct from flashing lights. 3. Intercepting aircraft executes an abrupt breakaway maneuver in the form of a climbing turn of more than 90 degrees. The action is the same in the day or at night. Series 6, Communication from Intercepted Aircraft, in distress. 1. Intercepting aircraft uses Series 2 signals. 2. Intercepted aircraft flashes all available lights at regular intervals. 3. Intercepting aircraft executes an abrupt breakaway maneuver in the form of a climbing turn of more than 90 degrees. The action is the same in the day or at night. 1.1.14, General Operating Laws. Fuel Reserves. Do you have enough fuel? For non-pressurized, single-engine, propeller-driven airplanes. When flying VFR by day, you are required to carry sufficient fuel to fly to the destination plus remain airborne at normal cruising speed for 30 minutes. When flying VFR by night, you are required to carry sufficient fuel, reach your destination plus remain airborne at normal cruising speed for 45 minutes. In addition, you are required to carry sufficient fuel for taxi and foreseeable delays prior to takeoff, rerouting or delays as a result of traffic, meteorological conditions, and other foreseeable delays. Note, you cannot commence a flight or change a destination in flight without confirming the above. When and for how long you can activate your ELT in order to test it. You may activate an ELT in order to test it during the first 5 minutes of an hour UTC for a period of not more than 5 seconds. ELT activation following an emergency landing. Any ELT will be activated by G loading following a crash. However, to be sure it has been triggered, it should be placed in the arm position as soon as possible after the crash and left on. Do not cycle it on and off to save the battery power, and do not turn it off until directed to do so by search and rescue personnel. Requirements for position reporting. When en route, VFR in uncontrolled airspace, and not communicating on an MF or an ATF, or VFR on any airway, you should continuously monitor 126.7 MHz. Reporting on this frequency is not mandatory, but listening for other reports and reporting your own position will improve safety by improving traffic awareness for collision avoidance and providing a starting point in the event of a search and rescue action. The basic VFR position report should take the following form: identification, position, time, altitude, VFR, or VFR AUT, destination. Be sure to know this. Safety note: you should try to make position reports to an FIC by using the appropriate FISE frequency, where they will be recorded by a flight service specialist and will be immediately available in the event of an emergency situation. Altitude selection. Selection is based on magnetic track in the southern domestic airspace or true track in the northern domestic airspace. For VFR flight, altitude selection begins at 3,000 feet AGL. Between 0 and 179 degrees altitude should be odd thousands feet ASL plus 500 feet. Between 180 and 359 degrees altitude should be even thousands of feet ASL plus 500. CVFR starts at 12,500 feet ASL. Above this, between 0 and 179 degrees altitude should be in OD thousands of feet ASL, and from 180 to 359 degrees even thousands of feet ASL. Communication failure procedures. If you have a radio failure between yourself and ATC while within Class B, C, or D airspace, then you must: 1. If the airspace which you are in is a control zone, leave the airspace by landing at the aerodrome within the control zone. 2. If the airspace is not a control zone, leave the controlled airspace by the shortest route possible. 3. Set your transponder to code 7600. 4. Maintain a listening watch on the appropriate frequencies. 5. Attempt to contact any other ATC unit or other aircraft on appropriate frequencies and request relay of information to the appropriate ATC. 6. If none of the attempts above succeed, attempt to contact the ATC unit via cell phone. 7. After landing, inform the air traffic control unit as soon as possible of the situation, usually by calling them after you've landed. If you need to get to an aerodrome so that repairs can be made, then you should call and make arrangements within the air traffic control unit to allow you to enter controlled airspace. They will then be able to issue instructions via light signals. Light signals. Light signals to aircraft from the ground. Series of green flashes: clear to taxi. Steady green light: cleared for takeoff. Steady red light: stop. Flashing white light: return to starting point on airport. Blinking runway lights: advised all vehicles and pedestrians to vacate the runway immediately. Light signals to aircraft in the air. A series of green flashes: return for landing. Steady green light: cleared to land. Series of red flashes: airport unsafe, do not land. Steady red light: give way to other traffic and continue circling. The firing of a red pyrotechnical light or flare: do not land for the time being. Minimum altitude obstacle clearance regulations. If you are flying over a built-up area or an open-air assembly of people, you must fly at an altitude which allows you to execute a safe landing in the event of an emergency, but never lower than 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a radius of 2,000 feet. There are exceptions to this, but they apply to operations such as air ambulance and police work. Elsewhere you cannot fly closer than 500 feet from any person, vehicle, or structure. Minimum altitude to overfly an aerodrome while en route. When flying overhead an aerodrome en route to another destination, therefore you are not planning to land at that aerodrome, you may not fly lower than 2,000 feet above aerodrome elevation AAE. Consumption of alcohol prior to flying. You may not fly as a crew member within 8 hours of consuming any alcohol or while flying under the influence of alcohol. You also may not fly as a crew member if under the influence of drugs, which would impair your ability to operate the aircraft safely. Hence starting an airplane. When you start an engine of an aircraft, you're required to have a person competent to control the aircraft seated in the pilot seat and ensure the precautions have been taken to prevent the aircraft from moving. In the case of a seaplane, the aircraft is in a location from which any movement of the aircraft will not endanger persons or property. Dropping of objects. You should not create a hazard to persons or property on the surface by dropping an object from an aircraft in flight. 1.1.15 Filing flight plans. When do you need to file a flight plan or flight itinerary? When flying VFR, you must follow a flight plan or flight itinerary unless the flight is to be conducted within 25 nautical miles of the departing aerodrome. You also need to file a flight plan if you are flying from Canada to the United States, even if the flight is less than 25 nautical miles. When conducting a flight into or within the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, a flight itinerary or flight plan needs to be filed prior to departure, except of course if the aerodrome of departure does not have facilities for transmission of the flight plan or itinerary. In general, a flight plan will need to be filed with an air traffic control unit, flight service station, or community aerodrome radio station. A flight itinerary has to be filed with irresponsible person, an air traffic control unit, flight service station, or a community aerodrome radio station. The exceptions for flight itineraries is for flights into or within the ADIZ. In such cases, flight itineraries can only be filed with an air traffic control unit, flight service station, or community aerodrome radio station. Changes to your flight plan. If you have filed a VFR flight plan or flight itinerary and wish to change your route, destination, or flight duration, then you're required to notify an air traffic control unit, flight service station, community aerodrome radio station, or the responsible person, of the intended change as soon as practicable. Arrival reports. If you have filed a flight plan, then file an arrival report as soon as practicable after landing, but no later than the search and rescue initiation time specified on the flight plan, or if no search and rescue time has been specified, then 1 hour after the last reported ETA. File the arrival report with an air traffic control unit, community aerodrome radio station, or flight service station. If you have filed a flight itinerary, then file an arrival report as soon as practicable after landing, but no later than the search and rescue initiation time specified on the itinerary, or if no search and rescue time has been specified, then 24 hours after the last reported ETA. File the arrival report with an air traffic control unit, community aerodrome radio station, or flight service station, or the responsible person. 1.1.16 Uncontrolled aerodrome operations. Procedures when arriving at an uncontrolled aerodrome. Aerodromes where MF is in force and aerodrome advisory is available. First choice. Primary method for joining is from the upwind side of the aerodrome crossover midfield at circuit altitude. If it is necessary to overfly the aerodrome to observe wind and traffic, then you should overfly at least 500 feet above circuit altitude. You may join directly on the downwind as well, but you should ascertain that there is no conflict with other traffic. You can also 1. Join downwind at 45-degree angle. 2. Join ST in on base. 3. Join straight in on final. Required radio calls whether or not an aerodrome advisory is available. 1. Report prior to entering the ATF or MF area, and where possible at least 5 minutes prior to entering the ATF or MF area. He should provide position, altitude, EVA, and arrival procedure intentions. 2. Report position when entering the aerodrome traffic circuit. 3. Report on the downwind leg if applicable. 4. Report on final. 5. Report clear of the landing surface. Remember, 1. Airplanes may fly within an ATF area without two-way radio equipment, but within an MF, you are required to have two-way radio communication equipment unless special arrangements are made with ATC. 2. If a frequency for the aerodrome is not published, then the default frequency is 123.2 MHz. Procedures when departing an uncontrolled aerodrome. When departing an uncontrolled aerodrome, do not be tempted to turn out early. Essential knowledge: no terms are permitted until reaching circuit traffic pattern altitude. Do not turn back toward the circuit or aerodrome until at least 500 feet above circuit altitude. Required radio calls from departing an uncontrolled aerodrome. 1. Announce your intentions prior to entering the maneuvering area of the aerodrome. 2. Announce departure intentions prior to moving onto the takeoff surface. If you are delayed in departing, announce delay and then rebroadcast intentions prior to moving onto the takeoff surface. 3. After takeoff, report departing from the aerodrome traffic circuit and maintain a listening watch on the MF or ATF until clear of the area. Procedures when transiting an MF or ATF area. You may not transit an aerodrome unless at least 2,000 feet above the aerodrome level unless you have approval from the appropriate air traffic control authority to do so. Required radio calls when transiting at an MF or ATF area. 1. Report prior to entering the ATF or MF area and where possible at least 5 minutes prior to entering the ATF or MF area. You should provide position, altitude, ETA, and intentions. 2. Report when clear of the MF or ATF area. Remember, if a frequency of the aerodrome is not published then the default frequency is 123.2 MHz. 1.1.17 Wake turbulence separation. Know this. The wake of other airplanes is most severe when behind and less than 1,000 feet below the airplane. The wake of an airplane is strongly dependent on the speed, configuration, and weight of the airplane. Wake turbulence will be strongest behind heavy aeroplanes flying slowly in the clean configuration. Know this. Wake turbulence from wingtip vortices will start at the point where lift starts to be generated, therefore at the point where the airplane begins to rotate, and will end when the nose wheel settles on the ground upon landing. Know these well. Wake turbulence classifications. For the purposes of assessing the potential severity of wake turbulence, airplanes are grouped by weight as follows. Group 1, Heavy. All aircraft with certified maximum takeoff weight of 300,000 pounds or more. Group 2, Medium. Aircraft certified with a maximum takeoff weight between 15,500 pounds and 300,000 pounds. Group 3, White. Aircraft certified with a maximum takeoff weight of up to and including 15,500 pounds. Wake turbulence avoidance in the airport environment. When taking off after a large aircraft has taken off, plan to become airborne before the rotation point of the large aircraft, and stay above its flight path or make a turn to take your aircraft away from the hazardous wake turbulence. Lift off before the rotation point of the large aircraft. Stay above the flight path of the large aircraft. Wingtip vortices begin at the point where the large aircraft rotates for takeoff. When taking off after a large aircraft has landed, plan to lift off after the point where the large aircraft touched down. Lift off after the touchdown point of the large aircraft. Wingtip vortices and where the large aircraft touched down. Try to fly above a heavy aircraft flight path, and avoid flying behind and less than 1,000 feet below a large aircraft. Wake turbulence exists behind and below a large aircraft. When landing after a large aircraft has taken off, plan to touch down before the rotation of the large aircraft. Touch down before the rotation point of the large aircraft. Wingtip vortices begin at the point where the large aircraft rotates for takeoff. When landing after a large aircraft has landed, stay above the glide path of the preceding aircraft, and touch down after the point where the preceding aircraft touched down. Take the same actions when the large aircraft landed on a parallel runway that is within 2,500 feet of the runway that you are approaching. Stay above the flight path of the large landing aircraft. Touch down after the touchdown point of the large aircraft. Wingtip vortices and where the large aircraft touched down. When landing after a large aircraft has taken off from a crossing runway, note where the aircraft was when it rotated. If it rotated after it crossed your runway, then try to land before the intersection point. If it rotated before it crossed your runway, then go around unless you're guaranteed to land before the intersection. If the heavy aircraft rotates before crossing your runway, it's a good decision to go around. If the heavy aircraft rotates after the intersection, then continue, but try to land before the intersection. ATC will provide separation between aircraft in different way classifications based on distance in a radar environment or based on time in a non-radar environment. Know the following. In a radar environment, the following separation will apply. Heavy aircraft behind another heavy aircraft, 4 miles of separation. Medium aircraft behind heavy aircraft, 5 miles of separation. Light aircraft behind heavy aircraft, 6 miles of separation. Light aircraft behind medium aircraft, 4 miles of separation. Know the following. In a non-radar environment, the following will apply. Have any aircraft departing behind a heavy aircraft will be provided a 2-minute separation if 1. The air traffic commences takeoff from the threshold of the same runway as the heavy air traffic. 2. The aircraft commences takeoff from the threshold of a parallel runway which is located less than 2,500 feet from the runway used by the heavy aircraft. Any aircraft departing behind a heavy aircraft or light aircraft departing behind a medium aircraft will be provided a 3-minute separation if 1. The aircraft commences takeoff from an intersection or a point further along the same runway as the preceding aircraft. 2. The controller has reason to believe the following aircraft will require more runway for takeoff than the preceding aircraft. 1.1.18 Useful definitions. Aerodrome. Any area of land, water, or other supporting surface used or designated, prepared, equipped, or set apart for the use either in whole or in part for the arrival and departure, movement, or servicing of aircraft and includes any buildings, installations, and equipment in connection therewith. Airport. An aerodrome in respect of which a Canadian aviation document is in force. In other words, an airport is an aerodrome which is certified to meet certain basic standards. The apron is the part of an aerodrome other than the maneuvering area intended to accommodate the loading and unloading passengers and cargo, the refueling, servicing, maintenance and parking of aircraft and any movement of vehicles and pedestrians necessary for such purpose. The maneuvering area is the part of an aerodrome intended to be used for taking off and landing of aircraft and for the movement of aircraft associated with takeoff and landing, excluding aprons. Displaced thresholds. A displaced threshold may be put in place at an aerodrome, or airport, for several reasons. Firstly, if obstacles penetrate into the approach path of a runway, then the threshold may be displaced in order to maintain a safe clearance over the obstacles. Secondly, if construction work is taking place on the runway, then threshold may be displaced temporarily, and finally, if the full length of the runway is no longer required, then the threshold may be displaced permanently. Permanent displaced threshold markings are arrows. Temporary displaced threshold markings are arrowheads at the displacement line. In both situations, the portion of the runway before the displacement threshold will be available for taxiing, takeoff, and landing rollout from the opposite direction. It may be used for landing too, but it is then clearly the pilot's responsibility to ensure that obstacle clearance is maintained. If the runway is closed before the displaced threshold, then it will be marked with a large X. Be warned, these markings are not always obvious or totally to standard, so the only way to be sure of a runway status is to check your NOTAMs. Closed runways. A closed runway, taxiway, or portion thereof is usually marked with large X's. Snow-covered closed surfaces may be marked with X's in a conspicuous color. Large aircraft. An aircraft with a maximum certified takeoff weight of more than 12,566 pounds. 1.1.19 Accidents. What a reportable accident is. It is important that you know the difference between a reportable aviation accident and one which does not have to be reported. 1. A reportable accident is an accident resulting directly from the operation of an aircraft in which a person is seriously injured or killed as a result of a. Being on board the aircraft, b. Contacting any part of an aircraft or its contents, c. Being directly exposed to the jet blast or prop wash or rotor downwash of an aircraft. 2. the aircraft sustains damage or a failure requiring major repair or replacement affecting A. Structural strength. B. Performance or flight characteristics. 3. The aircraft is missing or inaccessible. Basic legal requirements in the event of an accident. 1. Report the accident to the TSB via telephone, which are available in the AIM and can be called 24 hours a day, or via an ATS unit who will call the TSB. 2. Ensure protection of the occurrence site, aircraft, components, and documentation. This is the responsibility of the pilot in command, the operator, owner, and any crew member. Note: except to extricate a person or people, prevent destruction, or avoid danger to persons or property. No one may move or interfere with an aircraft involved in an accident, nor interfere with or disrupt an accident site without the permission of an investigator. If it is necessary to extricate people, prevent damage or danger, then, as far as it is possible, the condition of the aircraft and the occurrence site must be recorded by the best means possible prior to doing so.